join us again on another episode of the Commend Journey podcast. I am your host, Michael Diamond. We are back for another great episode with an industry voice, and we're greatly looking forward to our guest today. In true Commend Journey fashion, what we're going to do is sort of turn the microphone over to our guest and have them introduce themselves and tell us just a little bit about who they are. So, guest, take it away.
Thanks very much, Michael. My name is Chris Clarke. I am the president and principal of C Squared Security Consulting, based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. My background, maybe a little different than some other security consultants, came from the IT world first, application development, database, then into package implementation, and then project management. Did that for just over 10 years, and then moved back closer to home after traveling around the US and working for a while. I took over a project actually here in Halifax for the regional Port Authority, hired by a defense contractor who won the work. And it was a giant integration of, over a dozen products, also the civil work and everything else related to that on the communication side. And, ended up being about a $15 million project. And it was a bit of a drink through the fire hose, sink or swim scenario. Although having come from the IT integration world, I was very fortunate around that time between the, the convergence and the, migration from analog to digital technology. To be honest, it wasn't really that, dare I say, difficult of a transition. I mean, the project had its own challenges, but, within that first project, I was able to kind of, see, CCTV and access control and perimeter fence, chemical detection, radar, AIS. I mean, you got to name every kind of, I guess at the time, the technology that was there. It was very much almost like building a PSIM, if you will, at the time, piecemeal. So that was kind of my first foray into that. That was in around 2007, 2008. So for the most part, I've been focused on, consulting to the physical security space with a bit of a technology twist, dare I say. You did evolve now into doing some more threat, risk, vulnerability assessments, but still kind of holding on to my management consulting background, with a focus on, kind of requirements, use cases, and not that kind of rush to technology, which I think has kind of differentiated me over the years from others.
Yeah, I think that you bring a couple really salient points up, right? So first-time experiences are always interesting for no matter who you are in this industry. Many of them are challenging. I think my first big job as an integrator was post-training at, with lifts. The boss had me get up and start installing cameras that were 65 or 70 feet up off the air,
Right.
with a live street nearby. And it definitely made for a morning of sweaty palms and figuring out how to position things and cone things off correctly. I think a lot of the folks that listen to this are going to appreciate the fact that your introduction to the industry really was a drinking from the fire hose, baptism by fire experience, because a lot of us have them. And then secondly, your more IT or technical background on that end before coming here probably pays a ton of dividends to your clients when it comes to areas of just being secure foundationally, right? You're not rushing to the next big thing because you know already what works. You're already familiar with what cybersecurity means, not just as a buzzword, but also as practical applications. So that's probably very, very useful for your clients, I'd imagine.
Yes, it is. And as I tell a lot of people, I think if you've been in this industry longer than 15 years, and obviously I alluded to kind of switching over and being in that kind of crossover space, I think, you kind of have to unlearn what was done in the past. And I think, a lot of that focus at that time was, don't get IT involved because it's just going to make things more tricky, or, they're just going to cause more roadblocks. And I tell every customer I deal with, certainly the new ones, I go, if you're dealing with an integrator that says that to you, turn around and run in the opposite direction, because, as I'm sure we'll chat about as we go forward here, I mean, the evolution is, more going to be more focused on that technology world, and embracing that, and not that old school, analog, it sits over in its own silo.
Yeah, I almost equate it to like two kids playing when they're young, saying, don't tell mom
Exactly.
that you got hurt when we were out playing, or skating or whatever it is. I equate it to that. And I would agree with you that if your client or a facet of what they do, someone within their organization says, we don't want to get IT involved in this, I'd put up a big red stop sign. Hang on, wait a minute. Why not?
Exactly.
So an important part too. So when you look at the Canadian market, what makes it unique or challenging as far as the projects that you face when customers come to the table?
There's always the, dare I say, kind of the stigma of the Canadians, the Great White North. Everybody up here in our frozen tundra. But I mean, there is a point to be made about that. I mean, look, we do have obviously pretty significant urban centers, whether that's Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver. I mean, even in some degrees, Halifax, where I live. But a predominance of the work that I do, especially in Atlantic Canada, but across the country, is in that kind of ruggedized environment, whether that happens to be at a port authority or in a oil refinery or on a bridge or even just something that's in the middle of nowhere. So, I mean, I think that definitely plays a significant part, and not that it doesn't, obviously, in the U.S. or other parts of the world, but I mean, in the country. So, I mean, I think through past experience, whether using that port example from earlier or in other things, I think a lot of products. Let's just say, perfect example was a product we used in that port project that was, tested and developed in Arizona, and worked very well in the desert. However, when you put that into a port environment with salt and wind, and then obviously up of minus 40-degree temperatures. So I mean, having that adaptability and understanding that up front, versus understanding it once you've actually got everything installed and realize that there's a problem. So obviously factoring in, having, beta testing or tests, bench testing, that sort of thing up front. The other thing that came to mind, and maybe doesn't necessarily factor in, for someone, say south of the border, is, the currency exchange. And, obviously with the exception of a couple of years of the last 30 years, the Canadian dollar has held a weaker position to the US dollar, which has been great for Canadian exports. However, as it relates to us as consumers or, clients that are putting in a project, so what it's like sometimes, especially with significant infrastructure projects, there could be a, 6 to 12 month lag between, when everything is kind of budgeted and awarded to when it starts. And, if there's any kind of a delay in ordering product, you can see substantial increases, even just based on, the currency fluctuations. So, I think, two of those, whether it's almost like, tangible and intangible features, probably the two biggest significant differences I think it impacts in the Canadian market.
Yeah, it's a great point that a lot of our US listeners probably don't really have a good perspective on, which is the budgetary constraints and concerns and changes are one thing. Everybody that deals with projects big and small you're gonna run into them all the time,
Mm-hmm.
whether you want to or not. But when we're talking about the differences in currency markets and what something costs at one point versus what it might cost, say 6, 12, 18 months later, can be a huge challenge. And being able to navigate those and still land projects on time and on budget is a real challenge. So it's important to remember that for all projects that we're going to face.
I appreciate you bringing up the on time and on budget. Having been a certified project manager for 20 years, it's nice to to hear that being spoke of, because a lot of that doesn't get rolled into a lot of the projects they get brought out here.
Yeah, I think in the sales world, it's real easy to get focused on winning a project and having it move forward. But the way you get the next one and the next one and the next one is to make sure that they operate within budget. That way you can use that as a a runway for future flights. That's the way I would see it. So
For sure.
I think that's important. I wonder if there's a couple of examples in verticals that you work with where you've seen these same sort of examples play out.
A couple of examples. I mean, I know that, obviously I'll throw it back to that port project, which is kind of the flagship one in my career. I mean, you have scenarios where we had, and ironically, this was an intercom solution from back in the day, but our customer was an early biometric adopter using a vascular scan, and again, it's one thing. It's a nice summer day. You walk down to a vascular scanner, which is on the outside, and you get access into a fairly remote location, and it works. But temperature drops. You get some precipitation. Perhaps the scan isn't the greatest. Next thing you know, it's you have a lineup of people, generally in an industrial area, trying to get in. There was no, at that time, recourse for people who couldn't get a positive scan to get in or out. They'd have to probably trek 15, 20 kilometers or 10 miles ish, to a credentialing center, which may or may not be open, to get some sort of rectification. So, we had to come around with a solution that, ultimately was tying in, an intercom with a camera that could validate, someone's ID and look at their face. And, I mean, stuff like that. Ultimately, because the solution that was chosen was not, tested, in that kind of ruggedized, environment. In other situations you have, there was a bridge project we had where, cameras were going to be mounted on, the structure. And for those to be mounted in certain situations, the rivets of the bridge themselves, in certain situations, had to be removed. And, the structured brackets that came with the cameras, I mean, which were fine, I guess, for, regular kind of corporate, campus environments, again, we're not designed to sit on a bridge, and ultimately had to be retrofitted and specially designed through another engineering firm so that they would fit over the rivets and then obviously not fall apart in the middle of, bad weather. So, I mean, those are just two simple scenarios just based on one product works perfectly well in one environment, just doesn't fit in the other one, or it has to be kind of retrofitted, those square pegs pounded into the round holes to make it work. But, when you're trying to do that, in the case of the bridge example, you're a couple hundred feet up, looking down, and you're trying to negotiate that. I mean, it's much easier that, you're just going to go in, pull a rivet out, it's going to put it on, it's going to fit, versus, taking it off, putting it back on. And in some cases, you had to have authorized, bridge personnel there to do that work. So, I mean, the costs, escalate, over that. So, I mean, it kind of goes back again to talked about my introduction around that, avoiding that rush to technology first and understanding, whether it's requirements or some of the constraints that come with that. And, at the end of the day, it works well for, the manufacturer from a reputation perspective, the integrator from a profit loss perspective, and obviously, customer sat with the customer to make sure it works.
The bridge example, especially, is a really salient one, right? So you're talking about a change or an upgrade on a piece of infrastructure, which is going to involve multiple departments. And you got to get sign offs. You might have to get, like you said, bridge personnel who can okay that sort of a change. And there is something to be said for the rush to technology and why partnering with manufacturers that are more steadfast in their speed of approach to something to make sure that it is right as it arrives. I think that's important too. And yeah, you talked about it a lot in the description here and previously too, when we talk about the temperature differences. There just are. And that's a challenge in and of itself. It isn't just, it gets cold sometimes. There are large swaths of the year where it is cold. And I wonder if maybe that sort of leads me to my next question, which is that really how Commend has helped you in some of your projects? Is by working with the manufacturer that makes sure that that adheres to all those check boxes?
I think it's Commend's, dare I say, holistic approach to the market. It's not just, oh, we're just, an intercom system. I mean, it's that, that focus on the integration, is the understanding that I could be sitting in a SOC somewhere, and, not only do I need to understand, and have clarity on that voice that's coming in, potentially I need to validate, this person's identity, whether that's visually, whether that happens to be, with a voice recognition, whether it happens to be looking at someone's access control card or, however that is. You commend less as a security company, which obviously you kind of are, but again, most focus as a technology company that focuses on what I would have seen normally in the IT world. Again, back on requirements. It's like, oh, here's a business problem we've encountered. Oh, okay, well, what's that business problem? And not rushing the technology and say, well, this might not be a commend issue. However, we have partners that we deal with, and we can be part of the puzzle versus the entire solution. And I think companies that kind of rush and try to be all things to all people generally fail or are successful for a short period of time. But I'm sure we've all seen, especially in this day and age with so many acquisitions in the market. But all that to say, it's like, the interoperability and integration, kind of that open architecture approach that you guys follow, your focus on, the importance of cybersecurity, the TAA and NDAA compliance, ISO 27001, all those things to me are showing me that Commend continues to kind of not just be satisfied with, the status quo or meeting minimum requirements, but trying to lead the market. And I mean, speaking about open architecture, I mean, again, coming from my background, that's generally all that I specify are things that have open architecture. And, the security technology industry still has a ways to go to fully be open. But, the companies that are openly acknowledging that, open architecture is a better approach versus that kind of close proprietary one are the ones that I tend to be attracted to and want to work with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, speaking in terms of cybersecurity, what's your advice when you go to clients and talk about data security, especially in the world of critical infrastructure?
Cybersecurity, from whether it's, you think of the calling it network security or internet security, I mean, it is very important. And obviously, not a day goes by where we don't hear about some major breach or something that we all know is a breach, even though it's not disclosed by, immediately by the company. But ultimately, the biggest importance from a physical security perspective is educating the customer that a camera or an access control reader or an IP intercom is a network device, no different than a PC, no different than a VoIP phone. And if you pull something out the back, you'll generally see an Ethernet cable, and the connection on the back. And I go, would you leave a PC unattended, in a lobby or outside your building, even if you had like some sort of generic password protection on it? Unanimously, it would be no. And I go, well, ultimately, these things need to be treated in that regard, and, that means, password protection. It means having, not just on the device, but also, from whether that you have, an intelligent managed switch to manage that, to have firewalls. And I go, just because this is a physical security piece of technology doesn't mean you can't be thinking about cybersecurity in the same way, because it all has to be thought of that way. And the other thing I tell people is, okay, you got so much focus, you've got firewalls, you're worrying about people coming in and trying to penetrate you from outside, which is important. I go, but what about, the insider threat? What about, if I can get access into your server room or your raised floor data center, and I can stick a thumb drive into a server, and launch some ransomware that way, or grab, sensitive information and cause a privacy breach that way. I mean, that's just as important. And unfortunately, I've seen all too many times from a consulting perspective being inside and seeing faulty access control or faulty, types of doors in buildings, or, security guards that are not well trained to deal with that. Again, that to me, that's just as big as a problem as the outsider threats.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the points that I would want to draw out of that, there's a lot to it, but I think the education point is critical for customers. They need to understand that the office machine, the PC, the laptops that are in their office are part of a network. They probably understand that fairly easily. Do they understand the receptionist VoIP phone is on another network, and that it could possibly be attacked as well. And that it's likely that the IP address and the password to log into that phone is probably on a sticker on the back of that phone, because that is not what people think about. It takes 2 seconds for someone to locate that IP address and that password. And if they can get on your network, they could potentially get anywhere.
Exactly.
So what I like to do is sort of at the end of this is I like to have folks look forward for me. I like to have them look 5 years down the road and say, what are we going to be talking about 5 years from now in the industry? What's your perspective when you think about the security industry moving forward?
Well, I mean, from a generic perspective, I mean, it's, the Internet of Things, I think, is going to continue to be the primary focus, whether we're talking about, the use of the cloud to capture data, whether that happens to be video or access control or audio, whatever that happens to be, and how AI continues to kind of take a place in that world. I think 5 years from now, AI kind of being the buzzword will be more of a kind of a standard, kind of, I guess, standard terminology as part of a discussion versus, oh, that whole AI thing is pretty cool, and how that ties into, uh, you know, um, for example, drones, the use of drones for, security purposes or safety purposes, or I guess on the other end of the spectrum, how you prevent them from, causing grief from the other end of the spectrum, I guess, depending on whether it's an airport or happens to be, a port, or even just, a lot of the big thing up this way in Canada are drones dropping contraband or drugs inside of prisons. And then obviously, how do you deal with that? The ports have to deal with that too as well. So that's sometimes what drives, some of these technology decisions. So, I mean, I think, Internet of Things, AI is probably going to be the two. Those are probably going to be the two biggest game changers. But it's technology. In 3 months, 6 months, there could be an entirely different breakthrough. That we don't even know about yet. So, but obviously, based on what we know today, that's what I would think.
That's probably a good bet. I think we've seen an explosion really of drone technology in the past 5 to 10 years, going from something that's probably a little bit more uh, tinkerer or hobbyist to some fairly serious security drones now that are going to be deployed. So Chris, I want to thank you for your time. As you mentioned, GSX is in a couple weeks of this recording. I'd encourage you, if you're going to GSX, to stop by the Commend America's booth at 2321. So we look forward to seeing any of you that are going. And we want to thank Chris Clarke from C Squared for his time. So thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Michael. Greatly appreciate it.
You bet.